That was great, Henry.
You like that? Was that fun?
Yes, thank you so much, Henry. That was terrific. I think we can open up our Q&A period. I don't know quite how to monitor this, but I'm going to just let folks chime in. And we'll get you questions.
Sure.
Let me start, Henry, because we've had bits of this conversation before. So, there are several ways to set up the problem which you've set up. You can set it up in terms of targeting. You can set it up in terms of war fighting. So the lid is off, and now you're trying to decide what to do. But you only touch passingly on the question of deterrence and the whole question of what these capabilities mean. If both sides are looking at the fact that the other side has, some piece of this capability and so on. And I mean, I'm not saying that the way you set it up is wrong, because obviously in a war fighting scenario, you're going to be thinking about this. And I think if you pull back and ask what this looks like, if you're trying to make decisions when your adversary has the same capability you do,
yes.
Does that make deterrence, does that contribute to stability? I guess that's what I want to ask.
Well, let me,
destabilizing.
I am so glad you got the point of the lecture. And that is the point. The point of the lecture is to lift the hood on all those questions. First, just a comment. I have a group that I meet with. It includes officials and Hill staff. And we're trying to think about the next war. And it was really annoying getting this group together because they were all very, very smart. And I even say in the beginning, uniformly hard-headed, hawkish people. But I couldn't get them off the dime of getting the war started. They kept pleading with, well, here's how you deter the war. And I said, you can't deter a war until you have the war in your mind and you know what it might look like. Then you can try to figure out how to deter that war. In other words, you have to play out what things could go wrong in a shooting war. You want the missiles flying first in your mind to try to figure out what happens maybe. Now, you're going to get it wrong, you're really going to get it wrong if you don't think about that at all. And you just...
That's totally fair, but let me just give you...
Okay, no, wait a minute. You've asked several questions.
Okay.
I did not get done because you had several. My first point is to your point. The reason you do want to think about war, W-A-R, is you can't figure out deterring it until you know what it is. So you do need to have simulations where you imagine what happens when, oh, there's a pause and you have people clamoring to close down the war. Do they go to negotiate? Do people push, to go to punish to get that concession, etc.? You need to play that out, number one. Number two, I think exactly the point you raised is what you're going to discover. And that point is, if you are shooting at political nodes of control, the character of your adversary and yourself will not be symmetrical. It won't be symmetrical for a variety of reasons. Someone may have more missiles. The missiles may be better. That's prosaic, but it's always...
No, but that certainly came to my mind.
Okay, well, that's one thing. But then really interesting things happen. Maybe your adversary is the Soviet Union, and, they just don't have a whole lot of popular leadership, People don't like them who are underneath them. Or it could be that they have to have a military and certain lines of communication to certain command centers and to the party apparatchik to maintain control. Whereas the United States, maybe not so much. So there may be an asymmetry there. Also, urbanization may be an issue. So there are lots of factors to try to figure out. I mean, in other words, this is a problem. You don't solve it. You do better or worse at understanding it. It's like war. It's like deterrence. These are not scientific things. These are problems that you do better or worse at imagining and trying to shape your policy around. Now, my own view, you know, I'm not going to be coy about this, is I think if you can get people to think about backing off whacking cities, and I think you can, because I don't think even our worst adversaries are eager to use nuclear weapons. I think you can probably deter even the initial shooting if they know that if they get into a shooting war, they might lose control of the one thing they care about, which is rule.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so you need to know the culture, you need to know the vulnerabilities. You know, it gets to be a five-dimensional, you know, game. It's no longer checkers. But I
Let's
do
get
think,
someone else and,
yeah.
I'll back off, but I have another question, but maybe we'll get someone else.
Okay, well, I see, I figured we'd lose someone by now, but we haven't yet. So maybe there's some question or comment out there amongst the graduate students here. No? Oh, come on.
Henry, I've got a question if they don't.
Okay, by the way, you don't get graded on this.
Okay.
I mean, you
Okay.
can't suffer. There's no cost here.
Okay, good. Grading is definitely overrated. What I find a little bit interesting is I kind of felt that there was kind of a lost in translation as we went through the presentation. Because in the beginning, you know, you brought up the Digby, you know, the offense defense thing that, you know, offensively he's kind of indicated, but defensively we don't know yet. And then we slid into nuclear reactors, which are very much point targets. And then we went to a third thing with cities that are, well, not just cities, bridges, whatever, but things that are clearly not as defendable. So like, you know, when we talk about the range of, this is really a technology question.
Okay.
Because I don't know the answer, but, you know, you talked about 4 different kinds of offense. I think you talked about the, you know, the flying, you know, Japanese Army knife, you know, a Hellfire. You talked about, you know, tomahawks. You talked about ballistic missiles. You talked about, you know, boost glide systems. You know, and on one end, you know, the flying Ginsu, anybody you can shoot down a drone before the Hellfire gets shot. That's pretty defendable. A glide thing is probably undefendable for now. You know, back in Iraqi freedom, I think the Patriots were like 9 for 9 shooting down short-range ballistic missiles, but they were like 0 for whatever, trying to engage cruise missiles. So all I'm trying to get at is, like, number one, I don't even know, in the Saudi case, I don't even know, were they cruise missiles or were they ballistic missiles?
Mostly.
Okay, so then in January, those were entirely ballistic missiles that were going at the US bases in Iraq.
Yeah, that
Okay.
was an unopposed attack. There were no defenses.
Right, you would think the American military would say, politically, we don't deploy unless you let us defend our facilities. But anyway, I guess the bigger point is, can your presentation dive deeper into defendability? And it may be that, look, I may agree that nuclear reactors, that might be a sufficient reason to get out of the nuclear business because reactors are vulnerable. Let's not even get into.
Well, I mean, in certain regions.
Okay.
Let me answer your speech
Okay.
with a couple of observations.
It was a House of Commons question.
Okay. First, I told you that it was weird to put these two things together, but everybody by consensus said, oh, both topics are fascinating. Please talk about both. So I did. Okay.
Including me.
Having done that, let me make lemonade out of it. To understand what we should be doing diplomatically, militarily, we do need to think about how the offense-defense competition will unfold with regard to certain actors. Let me pick just for argument's sake, let's take China. It looks like right now we can do things to their homeland in larger numbers with nuclear ballistic missiles than they can by a wide margin. However, that will probably change in the next decade. I mean, it won't be as lumps, you know, it won't be as, you know, lopsided. Instead of, you know, 1,500 to, you know, scores of things, it'll be hundreds versus, you know, hundreds of things. And so that may even steven up a bit. But what will change is the ability of us to use shorter range or theater range missiles, non-nuclear, both at things at sea and in the air that leave ports, but also, if we choose, to go to the mainland. And it may take a while before the Chinese can do the same thing, and they will have to travel much more distance than we will, you know, if we can figure out some way to take advantage of our alliances and the proximity of certain American territories, etc. On the flip side, when the Chinese do develop long-range accurate fires, both nuclear and non-nuclear in numbers, presumably, you know, in a decade or so, we will have wanted desperately from this date forward to have been developing defenses that we don't have, things that work rapidly, that have cheap shots. I don't know if we can do this, but boy, you better hope so. And, you know, all of this will impact what kinds of diplomatic limits you'll be talking about or trying to reach, depending on how that competition unfolds. So, yeah, it's very much part of the great drama that I'm lifting the curtain on. I'm agreeing with you, right? But it is the case that the technologies, the Hellfire, for example, can be put to play on things that have longer range. It is the case that the Hellfire can be put on a drone that can evade defenses, which it easily can do. Those technologies, the real question is, can we produce them in large numbers, and can we draw down the cost for longer range delivery? I mean, generally, the longer the range of delivery, the more expensive the unmanned system. But it could be that after you do some expensive shots at long range, you can use, you know, something that's a drone that carries small submunition things, and it takes advantage of the initial breaches. So, I mean, there are all sorts of things at play here. It isn't just missiles. It could be, you know, manned and unmanned bombers that release large numbers of things. And this is for both sides. Presumably, you want to get to a stage where both sides can, in a non-nuclear way, threaten enough targets that neither side has an interest in engaging in a war that could challenge political control. And then instead of being mutually assured in destruction, it would be mutually assured in threatening, you know, political control, such that there would be some desire to limit the offense-defense competitions in some discernible way that would, you know, favor one side or the other, but would be the substance of whatever kinds of agreements you would negotiate. So, I mean, it would be a preview. It's a little complicated. My guess is the human race isn't cut out for this, but it's an interesting set of problems to think about. And I do think, to a lesser or greater extent, policymakers and military planners are going to be seized with this more, you know, or they should be.
Thank you.
Matt, did you have a question before?
I was going to ask a question. I don't know if that was.
Absolutely.
I wanted to kind of build off of Steph Haggard's point a little bit. And I guess I'm also, beyond just the deterrence, but once the missiles start flying, I'm still having a little bit of trouble seeing how this then leads to sort of the political ends of the war. And most of what I'm seeing with these missiles they are tools of compellence.
Of what? I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?
Compellence. Compellence. So blowing something up will in some form compel the adversary to give in. But that link between using the missiles and the political end seems to be somewhat underdeveloped. And I'm even wondering a little bit if part of your issue of trying to get the war started when you ran these simulations or discussion groups was people were just having difficulty seeing what the purpose of these missiles would be.
Well, we should just get rid of the Defense Department and any offensive capability. That's a possibility. I'm being glib because there's something a little over-argued here, and that is, well, it's compellence, it's not deterrence. By the way, that is one of the great truth arguments, that something's compellence versus deterrence. I mean, it's very subtle. And I know the political scientific and the military science world makes a great deal of this, but I would be a little.
I think the distinction isn't very important either, which is why
okay, well,
actually build off of Steph's point and think that even after the missiles are started, that this is.
It is fair enough to argue that wars are not something that are easy to imagine happening. And you can go further that you gotta hope that you figure out means of competition that not only deter wars militarily, but economically, politically, culturally, and you do. But it's not the way states are yet organized. It seems like every state that is in the business of pushing other countries around, whether it's Russia or China or the United States, or even the lesser powers, get into building military forces. And the question always has to be, how do we use military science to keep these military investments from wiping out civilization? I mean, I think we have a stake in pushing away from targeting, innocents in massive numbers. And we need to use our heads to try to figure out how, if we're gonna have militaries, that we don't just jump to, what we would do if we didn't think things through very much. I worry about that. I mean, everyone since nuclear weapons, actually, even before nuclear weapons, if you read Churchill, he was worried about modern warfare, period, never mind nuclear war, that it would wipe out too much of humanity before, humanity pushed back and saved itself. Well, I don't know, was he wrong? I think we got to worry about that stuff. And I think one way to work it out is to think about war and work backwards, so that you reduce the likelihood of anyone thinking that it's a cakewalk or they're going to get some clear advantage, or that the way to stop a war is to take out some big city somewhere with a multi-megaton weapon. I don't know. Just a thought. I mean, I really, if you want to know why why I've spent a good portion of, everything I've done since actually 1972 or 4 has been about this. I don't know how effective it is, what I'm doing, but I'm interested in it. And I'm interested in it because there's a part of me that's scared about this. I don't want it to happen.
So, Henry, I wonder if I can sort of extend this conversation in a particular way. I wrote a piece recently in the Journal of Strategic Studies that talks about the effect of pilotless or humanless vehicles, right? That you're emphasizing a technological change that we have participated in over a long period of time, which is your graph shows this improvement in precision. A different dynamic, and potentially these two things are going to work in different ways, is taking humans out of the direct line of fire in combat.
Right.
And in your presentation, I don't think this was your intention, but it's conceivable that somebody could confuse these two elements. I wonder if you could, from your perspective, talk a little bit about which of these you see as the more critical problem for some aspect of the, security always has these three elements. It's sort of whether there's a contest, how the contest evolves, whether it's a big contest, a quick one, and also who wins. Because you could have a big contest that's favorable to one side or a big contest that's indecisive or whatever. So
Right. When you say contest, is it a war or is it just a competition prior to?
It could be some kind of military violence. I'm going to let you define.
I like war. I mean, this is just a common word.
I'm completely okay with that, but I want to not box you into that point.
Okay.
Where it could be, for example, that you think precision is really important because, one of the things we did with the shock and awe campaign was we destroyed a lot of Saddam Hussein's military capability with very little impact on civilians. And maybe that was a wonderful thing, but there's also you can also tell stories about how it failed to achieve certain military objectives or political objectives as well.
Well, you raise a useful and important historical point. There are people that argue, and it certainly has to be dialed in, that one of the advantages of being so barbaric, because we had to be in bombing the cities, because that's all we could use the damn bombers to hit for the most part, was that no one in the Second World War in Germany could come to the conclusion that they were stabbed in the back by the political leadership. No, they lost the war, and they could see they lost the war because everything around them had fallen as a direct result of them having lost. So there's something to that. I don't know if I want to emphasize that, because the cost morally to doing that today is a lot higher than in the 40s. In the 40s, there was no moral cost for doing aerial bombing as great as it is today, because the technological options were so few. Whereas now we're ethically more on the hook because, well, we have more choices because of precision. But I do think the bigger point I thought you were raising is something which I did not examine in this little brief, but which is very important. Having the legs to deliver munitions, or in the case of that Hellfire, just kinetically around, depends not only on having missiles and unmanned systems, it depends on having a brain and eyes and ears. And you cannot afford to be lobotomized in space or any other way. So being able to have surveillance, communication, command functions, being able to get target acquisition and bomb damage assessment, all of that, which is based on things that don't shoot, becomes terribly important. And if those things are vulnerable, they don't work, and that becomes probably as 1,000 is to 1 with regard to the shooter versus, these systems. So those things become much, much more important. And I think you could do a lot worse than build an enormous mobilization base to build a lot of missiles and a lot of warheads and not do it, but really make sure that your eyes, ears, and nervous system in space and on the ground are invulnerable. Because you can choose to ramp up or not, and you can deliver the goods. But it doesn't matter how many things you have that can go distance or go boom if, you know, you get lobotomized. And so I don't know if that touches on an answer or is it all relevant to your observation. Does that help?
Yeah, I think it does. One of the things that it strikes me about is the phrase that you've used that we've heard, you know, in this community before is if you can see it, you can hit it. So being able to see it or being able to deny someone seeing things becomes very important. You build lots of tunnels nowadays, not because in the old days you built tunnels for different reasons, but today it's to avoid observation. So
Right, right. And you know, the concrete of today is so much super harder than any of the concrete of the 60s. So it's not so easy to knock out. And I think, on the other hand, political control actually depends on known visible things. And you need police stations. You may have to have collection points for, you know, watching the public or whatever it is. And, you know, you can't hide those too much because if you do, people kind of don't know who's in control. Now that could be changed, but you'll notice that there are lots of cameras and they're visible. Now, I don't know at what point you just throw up your arms. I mean, it could be that the definitive rejoinder to all this nonsense is, well, we just can't make that much ammo. I mean, I've heard someone, you know, argue that, and I think at some level they're absolutely right. But do you want to get into a contest over this? It's open to question. And if you don't, what do you revert to? You know, do you give up or do you start getting barbaric? I mean, you know, how does it work? How does it work?
Can I jump back in? You told the historical story in terms of both precision and yields.
Yes.
And I'm trying to think through the relationship between those two things, because in a strange way, more precision could just kind of be the same as having, you know, requiring smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller yields. I mean, if you're knocking out the guy in the backseat of a car, you know, and you're trying to avoid killing the driver, then the yield drops down to practically nothing, right?
The way
And
I like
there's some
describing it.
dynamic here.
No. Well, let me give you.
Yeah, there's some dynamic here, though, between precision and yield. I mean,
Yeah, it's y to the 2/3.
Lowers the demand for yield.
Yeah, it's y to the 2/3. The yield is related to the probability of kill as to the 2/3 power. So that means it's super leveraged accuracy, whereas yield isn't. You can increase the yields many-fold and not get the same effect of just a slight change in inaccuracies being reduced. So for example, I like to say, if you're accurate enough to be near the doorknob, a little bit of energy twisting the doorknob opens the door. If you can't get to the doorknob, you need a gun to blow the doorknob off. If you cannot see the doorknob, you have to blow the door off. And if you can't see the door, you got to blow the whole building down.
Right.
And I think that's a kind of crude way. I can send you the primer with all the numbers. I don't want to display my lack of memory, but it's leveraged several orders of magnitude in favor of working accuracies rather than yields. That's the reason why we got rid of so many of our weapons and why the yields have come down so much. We don't need them.
Yeah, but I guess I'm struggling with the question here, but it seems like it's almost like this increase in accuracy makes the conversation about counter value targeting and counter force targeting kind of very different conversations, because if you're counter value targeting, you're still going to rely on killing a lot of people. I mean, but if you're in this game,
I'm trying to suggest that there are things you can do that don't kill people, but worry people enough to say stop.
Yeah, I'm not. This is something we've disagreed on before, because I think
some people, civilians in particular, like the idea of lots of blood to end things, and they may be right.
But Henry, if you're targeting a nuclear power plant, I'm sorry, I've said this to you before, that's counter-value targeting, my friend.
Yeah, but you
Because
didn't.
if you're creating Chernobyl, you're killing hundreds of thousands.
Steph, stop. You didn't watch all of the points before that. In other words, you have the opportunity of putting something in the parking lot, shutting everything down, killing no one.
Right.
You have the option of saying, okay, I'm going to get more serious. I'll make you operate off the diesel generators.
Right.
In other words, you can do this in steps. Now, I am not arguing that you should do this. Not only that, but if you do the simulations, and I've been doing the work, there are periods of time where you can hit things, even have a radiological release, but almost no one gets killed. So there are variations on this. And I think you've got to pay attention. It's not a binary. If you get into the binary character of war or any action, then things, they don't need analysis. You just throw the
I think
switch.
that's one of the main points you're making is that this thing is scalable now.
Right.
In a way which is just very different,
Than what it was before.
Sort of run from, here
Right.
all the way.
Yeah.
To
You get, that's the point.
city, right?
That's
Every
it.
point along that vector.
Well, yeah, and it puts more of a premium on trying to think things through a little bit. Now, I'm one thing that we got into the habit of saying, and I think it was true in the Cold War period when we were relying on those massive weapons to do military and Bravo and Delta targets. I remember Fred Clay once interrupted. Someone made an argument, and it was the politically correct argument on the hawkish side, which is, well, nuclear weapons deter. To make sure they deter, we have to make sure they go off, and we want to know that they're exactly going to produce the yield they should. So we need to do lots of testing to make sure that. And he got up, he said, excuse me, if one of these things ever goes off, who the heck knows what's going to happen? We're not going to be worried about whether the yield, was 70% or 20%. It's going to be a whole new avenue and arena that we just don't have the ability to understand. So there is a tendency to think today that, well, if a war starts, well, that's it. We can't think about it. I think what I'm trying to argue is the point you're making, that it's because of the scalability, that is a moral cop-out.
Right.
That maybe they're right. That, that my notion that this can be rationalized very much may be stupid as well. But boy, you really want to run the traps on this before you come to that conclusion. And I'm not sure we've even begun. Because when I talk to people about this offense-defense competition, 10, 20 years in a roadmap, everybody looks at it like, well, no, we haven't done that. Why would you bother? And I go, well, you want to know how much you can play that out and how much you can iterate and whether it's worth doing. You need to at least fail at that. I don't know that we're trying very hard. It may be a dead end, but I'm not convinced we know. Does that help?
No, totally. I mean, I'm on board.
There are versions of this that are already popping up in military debates. It's now very hard to get through the Naval War College without writing a thesis on how you're going to beat the Chinese Navy in the East China or South China Sea. And then there's this big long pause where there's no discussion of what next.
Oh yeah, no, it's quite amazing. We're going to shoot planes in the sky, missiles from coming in, ships coming out of ports, maybe ports, and we're going to cauterize it. And we don't really have to think about South Korea or Japan or Taiwan. They're all lesser included problem sets. And it's like, wow, good luck. That's optimistic. Is that a way to think about deterrence? Is that a way to think about how you invest and how you do your diplomacy about those investments in strategic capabilities and theater war capabilities? It doesn't sound right to me. It sounds phony. that's where we are.
Other questions?
Oh boy.
Again, Henry, thank you so much. This has been
Okay.
terrific. I had my anxieties about how this would turn out, but it was, I think the medium is not always the message. Sometimes it's the messenger. Thank you so much for a great talk.
Well, thank you for your
Thanks, Henry.
generosity. Same there with you, Steph.
So long, all. And thanks
Okay.
to Christina at our end for
Yes, and my staff at my end.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you,
Okay.
everyone.